So a man is shot through the heart in the last half of a minute by A. He's shot through the heart in the preceding quarter minute by B. He's shot through the heart in the preceding 1/8 of a minute by C, and so on. Presuming that the man is alive to begin with and that each shot kills instantly, the man must be already dead before he is shot. Therefore, he cannot be killed by any of those bullets. Now, I think it was the... We're getting... Okay. I think it was the day after my 10th birthday. It was March, when we usually have the last big storm of the winter outside of Boston in the US. And there must have been a severe storm because the schools were closed. And I remember that I couldn't wait to get outside. I went down for breakfast, and my mother turned when she heard me come into the kitchen. I sat down at the table, and I recall that the kitchen had a kind of a bitter cloud in the air. And my mom was not a great cook, but she was extremely experimental. And she was always developing some concoction, some new concoction. And they all fell out kind of under the rubric of tiger's milk. And it was supposed to be extremely good for you. But the recipe changed weekly. So holding a half-filled glass of brownish liquid out to me, she said, "Today we'll have breakfast a bit later, but first I would like you to drink this." And she called it cactus tea and said it has magic properties. And it will show you the world through your grandfather's eyes. Now, I remember the phrase, "through your grandfather's eyes." And the idea seemed odd and kind of attractive. Granddad was the only adult that I knew who could play like a child. And he would play with me for long hours. He wasn't afraid to do that, and he wasn't like the other adults who would keep an arm's length. But my mother's words on that day seemed particularly odd because my granddad had died 2 weeks before. So the idea of seeing through a dead man's eyes seemed quite frightening. But it also seemed very enticing. She also said, "You will learn a secret about yourself today that no one else knows. And it's something that you can't learn in school." And she knew that I hated school, so that was good propaganda for what she wanted me to drink. Now, I gave my normal resistance to the act against her desire to have me drink what she wanted me to drink, and it was sort of at the end, the tail end of that period in a child's life when the parent has total control over what goes into the child's body. But she had indomitable will, and she was going to drink it with me. So she joined me, and I acquiesced, and we chugged it down together, and it tasted terrible. and we had some apple juice to chase it down, and that tasted terrible too. And I felt nauseous, and she told me that that was normal and that it would pass. And I decided that it was time to get outside the reach of her will at that point. So I went to the family library where the record player was. And on the record player, there was a 78 RPM record. And the 78 RPM record was I Can Hear It Now by Edward R. Murrow. Now, I started it up, I put the needle on the record, and I listened to the voices of Adolf Hitler and Churchill and Stalin. And Murrow's deep overtonal of voiceover of the other recordings. Now, I didn't know who they were, but I liked the background sounds, the sound of vehicles, of crowds babbling, and the clicking of cameras, and the variety of voices and languages and accents. And I imagined the spaces where the recordings took place. They opened into a deep sonic space, and I began watching the stylus being drawn across and along the groove toward the spindle that poked through the center of the record. And I picked up my father's magnifying glass from his desk, and I watched more closely how the needle vibrating, scraping the walls of the groove. I looked at the intricacy of the ball of dust that built up on the needle, and I wondered what was in it. The groove seemed to expand into a valley, and the stylus reminded me of a spaceship bumping along the sides of the valley. And then the valley turned into a city street, and the stylus seemed like a huge careening industrial drill digging into the asphalt and scraping the walls of the buildings on each side. I began to feel that the drill was somehow reading the street, and the sound I heard was the street speaking to me, for me, only in a language that I understood. I realize now that the rotation of the record had a hypnotic effect on me, and I felt that I had become that stylus, and it was reading the street, and I was reading the street. I feared the spindle at the center and the inexorable force drawing me toward it. I realized that even though I, the stylus, appeared to be moving according to my will, in fact, I was enslaved and had no will of my own. I couldn't move at all. It was the turntable and the record that turned while I remained still. I resented my helplessness as I was drawn to the center. I felt like death was at the center. And it wasn't fair. Death should be at the side, not at the center. Why did it have to be there at all? My father came into the library. I accidentally wrote hospital when I wrote this rather than library. He seemed to be watching me a long time. I don't know how long. I became aware of his presence and looked up. He looked so strange, towering above me, and I wasn't sure that he was who he was at first or what he was at first. I couldn't recognize him. He seemed so alien. He reminded me of the spindle, and I was afraid of him. But then I smelled him, and I realized he was my daddy. And then I smelled the room. I smelled all the books on the shelves. I smelled the vinyl. It had a kind of sweet, acrid scent that reminded me of the horrible taste that still hung in my mouth. And then I threw up. My father put a wastepaper basket in front that was next to the desk in front of my face and held me as I threw up into it. As I heaved, I felt like all my insides were coming out of my mouth. My body was turning inside out, my skin reversed, and I was being eviscerated. I felt no pain, only an absolute need to expel. I wept as my body was taken over by a new violent rhythm coming from my anus, through my stomach, stomach that forced my whole body to arch and release through the peristaltic convulsions. The convulsions engulfed all my consciousness. I began to feel like my body didn't belong to me. I was frightened. I thought that I was going to die. I smelled the inside of the wastepaper basket and looked at the texture of its walls and floor. It was a dark room with no windows, and on the floor of that room was a curious gooey substance that I realized had come out of my stomach. I touched it, and it was slippery and then sticky between my fingers, and I put some on my tongue, and it stung my tongue and tasted like earwax, and I threw up again. My father continued to hold me and say soothing things into my ear, and waited until I felt ready to leave the dark room. I pulled my head out of the wastebasket, and he let me go, and he left the room. He was gone a long time. I heard a sound that was the kind of hum that seemed to come from everywhere. I heard kids playing in the street outside, the cars, the creaking of frozen branches of the trees. I heard my brothers moving around and some music on the other side of the house and the sound of water in the pipes, and I heard a sound behind all those other sounds. Dad came back with a towel to clean the floor and the rug and the turntable. I felt that I had done something wrong and was ashamed. He calmed me, asking me, "Isn't it beautiful?" I wasn't sure what he meant. He then said some things about my brain and the tea my mother had given me that morning. And looking back, I realized that he was explaining the serotonin and dopamine neuroreceptor system in my brain. I guess he was explaining it for my older self and was just storing the information in my subconscious for later recall. What I do clearly recall now is that he said that the cactus and the humans were co-evolving, and that the cactus knew some things about us that we did not know about ourselves. He switched the turntable to 33 RPM and put another record on, this time his favorite piece of music, Toscanini's rendering of Verdi's Requiem, which I inherited when he died 2 decades later. He handed the magnifying glass back to me, and I took it, and I looked at my hand through the magnifying glass. And then he took one of the books off the shelf and said he wanted to read something to me while I was looking through the magnifying glass. Years later, I found The Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley on the shelf in the library and recognized it from the cover. I found the passage he had read to me. Huxley was sitting in his own library when he wrote. I looked through the magnifying glass I held in my hand and repeatedly shifted my focus, looking through the glass and then looking at the reflection of my library with its 9 windows, the snow-covered trees glistening in the sunlight outside, projecting off the surface of the glass to my eyes. The room in microcosm complete, and there in the midst of that tiny room sat I, holding this glass before me. I felt my mind fold back into itself. My father's voice seemed to be coming from inside my mind. I saw myself there in Huxley's library, holding his glass in my hand. I smelled the winter air and was reminded that I wanted to go outside. I remember my father watching me as I left the library. When I went downstairs, my mom was quietly sitting in a rocking chair in the living room, and her eyes were closed. She seemed to be asleep. I remember looking at her and thinking how still she was. I thought she was dead and began to cry. I touched her face to see if it was cold, and she opened her eyes, smiled, and hugged me. I asked her to come outside with me. She looked at me for what seemed a long time and shook her head and said, "Go ahead, see yourself."